I've never been one to talk about these things, but I think it's time I share. My name's Jake. I'm 28, and I've always been obsessed with hiking. Back then, I was living in Denver, and I took a break to do a solo hike, which is something I've always done. I needed some time to myself, to clear my head, you know. It was a pretty remote trail, one of the most secluded spots in the Rockies, not much foot traffic. I got there early, way before the sun came up, and the only sound I could hear was nature. It was calm, no rush, just soaking in the peace that only a solo hike in the mountains can bring. But something changed after a bend in the trail where it got narrower. I saw a guy sitting on a rock, right in the middle of the path, doing nothing, just staring ahead. That was weird. The place was empty, and it wasn't normal for anyone to be out there that early, especially alone. I couldn't see him clearly, but it looked like he wasn't moving, just sitting there, staring into nothing. I walked past him, trying not to be rude, but my stomach churned. I can't explain it. But there was something about the way he was acting that set off alarms. He had on a dark jacket and jeans, and he looked like he'd been there for a while. Skin pale, eyes sunken. He didn't say a word, and deep down, I felt like he was watching me. Not like someone who spots a stranger on the trail, but more like he knew exactly who I was. I tried to shake off that feeling and kept going. There wasn't much else to do, so I just pushed on, trying to act like it was no big deal. But something about the guy kept nagging at me. He was still sitting there, motionless, staring ahead, and that's when I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder a few times, and each time it seemed like he hadn't moved. But on the third glance, when the trail opened up a bit and I thought I was in a safer spot, that's when I realized what was really bothering me. He was following me. At first it was just a feeling, but then it became clear. The guy had gotten up and was a decent distance behind me, just watching as I walked. At first I thought it was a coincidence that he was heading to the same spot I was, but as I picked up the pace, he matched it. Every time I walked faster, he did the same. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the weight in my throat only grew heavier. My heart was pounding, and the peaceful sounds of the trail now felt muffled by this oppressive feeling. Something was seriously wrong. I tried to pick up the pace, doing that thing where you tell yourself, don't look back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer. The sound of his boots hitting the rock started blending with my own steps, like we were walking together. No words, no interaction, just silence. I started wondering if he was watching me closely or if he just didn't care, but his presence was making me way too uncomfortable. I rounded a bend in the trail and my instincts screamed for me to take a shortcut, a path that veered off the main trail, one that most people wouldn't normally take, but it seemed like my only way out. I knew he was still behind me, and the feeling was so suffocating that my mind couldn't think of anything else but to run. I sprinted toward the shortcut, not daring to look back, my body already in full panic mode. But when I passed through some thicker trees, the silence made me stop. There was no more sound of footsteps, nothing. I stood still in the middle of the path, trying to hear any noise that would tell me he was still there. But it was completely silent, even more than usual, and that's when I realized he had vanished. I looked around, feeling the tension rise, but there was nothing. The guy was gone. It was like he had evaporated into the shadows of the trees. I stood there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. Fear hit me in a way I couldn't control. That feeling of being watched still lingered, even though he wasn't there anymore. I didn't know whether to keep going, whether I was safe, or if I was just imagining things. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment I even thought about turning back, but something inside me told me to keep going. It was like my body already knew I wasn't in danger anymore, but my mind was still trapped in that irrational fear, making me question reality. That's when, almost without thinking, I looked back and saw something that froze me. He was there, but not on the trail. He was farther away, almost at the edge of the forest. His eyes, I'll never forget those eyes, were fixed on me again. He was standing between the trees, but now he seemed distorted, like the light around him was bending in a strange way, making his body appear taller, slimmer. And even from such a distance, I could still feel his eyes piercing right through me, like he wasn't just watching me physically, but seeing inside me, like he knew exactly what I was feeling. I turned around and didn't look back again. I ran like I never had before. I knew that if I looked at him again, it might be too late. I ran without stopping until the trail opened up into a wider area where there were more people around. The sound of my ragged breath mixed with the pounding of my heart made me feel like I was finally out of danger. The sensation of being followed disappeared, and I was able to think more clearly. But when I looked back one last time, my blood ran cold. The man wasn't on the trail anymore. He wasn't anywhere. At first I thought he had disappeared into the forest, but then I realized something even stranger. The feeling that he was always one step ahead of me, watching, guiding me somehow. Like he knew exactly where I was, even though I had gotten so far away. I have no explanation for what happened that day. I tried to go back to the spot several times, hoping to find some clue, something that would help me understand what it was, but I never saw the man again, and the trail was always empty, as if nothing had happened. Still, something told me he was still there, somewhere. And to this day, whenever I find myself alone in nature, I get this strange feeling, this unease, like his eyes are still watching me. I've never told anyone this story until now. I know it sounds crazy, but I know what I saw. Something on that trail that day wasn't right, and I've never been able to look at desolate paths the same way again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I'm Alex, and this story happened in the fall of 2022. I've always enjoyed solo adventures, especially camping. At that time, I was going through a tough phase, so I decided to get away from everything and disconnect for a bit. I chose to camp in a remote area of the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. It was a place I'd been to before, but never alone. The idea of being somewhere so isolated, far from any signs of civilization, seemed like exactly what I needed. The fresh air, the sound of the trees swaying in the wind, everything just felt perfect. Nightfall came quickly, and the chill started setting in. I set up my tent, lit a campfire, and just sat there, quietly, listening to the crackling of the burning wood. There was something peaceful about that solitude, but as darkness settled in, I started feeling a little uneasy. I was alone, and the silence was so thick it felt like the forest itself was breathing. I tried not to overthink it, but something started to bother me. That's when I heard the first sound, a faint crack, like someone stepping on dry leaves coming from somewhere outside my tent. At first I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe a small animal, like a deer or even a squirrel. But then the sound happened again, louder this time. The crack was followed by another, and then another, like someone was walking around my tent. My heart started racing, and a strange feeling took over my mind. I knew there was no one out there. I was sure I was alone. But at the same time, the thought that someone might be watching me froze me for a moment. I peered through the small gap in the tent, but all I could see was darkness. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence returned to its deep, eerie calm. The fear started to grow. I decided to leave the tent and take a look around, hoping to find some logical explanation. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out carefully, trying to be as quiet as possible. As soon as my foot hit the ground outside the tent, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked around but saw nothing, no shadows, no movement, just darkness and the tall trees surrounding me. I moved a little farther from the tent, turning on my flashlight to light the way. But what I found was something I didn't expect. A trail of footprints. Deep impressions, like someone had walked through the area around my camp. The tracks were fresh, clearly made not long ago. They led away from my tent, toward the thick forest. They didn't look like animal prints because they were way too big, like a person had walked there but without any sign of rushing, as if they were just walking calmly. I didn't know what to make of it. The first thought that came to my mind was that maybe someone else was camping nearby. But then I realized how unlikely that was. The place was remote, and the nearest trail was about 5 miles away. I looked back at my tent, and the fear grew even more. How had someone gotten here without me noticing? I hadn't heard any cars or footsteps up until that point. I felt a chill run down my neck and decided to head back to the tent as fast as I could. The sound of my boots crunching through the dry leaves felt deafening, and the cold air seemed to squeeze my lungs. When I finally got back to the tent, I quickly started grabbing my things and packing them up. My body was shaking, but I tried to stay calm. All I wanted was to get out of there as quickly as possible. I was about to close the last backpack when I heard it again. Closer this time. Footsteps, far off at first, but clearly getting closer. My heart raced in my chest and I couldn't control myself anymore. Something was wrong and I didn't know what. I looked around but didn't see anyone. No lights, no sound of cars or anyone else around. Just that eerie silence, like the forest was closing in on me. I knew I was being watched. The feeling was so strong, like someone was there, invisible, just waiting for me to leave the safety of my tent. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed the last backpack, zipped up the tent, and with my heart nearly pounding out of my chest, I started walking away from the camp. The feeling of being followed grew with each step. The fear was making me dizzy, but I knew I couldn't stop. When I was just about out of the camp area, I glanced back one last time, hoping to see something, but everything was quiet. Just the darkness staring back at me, and I forced myself not to look at the shadows of the trees around me. I was almost at the end of the path that led to the road when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were right behind me. They weren't hurried, but calm, deliberate, like someone was following me on purpose. My breath quickened, and I started walking faster, the sound of my own footsteps blending with the strange noise of whoever was behind me, getting closer and closer. I didn't know what to do. I kept glancing back, but there was nothing. With every step, the sound seemed to get louder. I tried to run, but my legs felt weak, like fear was taking over every muscle in my body. The only thing I could hear was the sound of footsteps behind me, always just a bit closer. The fear of turning around and seeing something, of facing whatever was there, paralyzed me. I didn't want to turn my back on the sound, but I didn't want to face the unknown either. When I finally reached the road, I was almost out of my mind. I knew I was close to a safe point, but the feeling of being followed wouldn't leave me. I started walking faster, almost running. I didn't look back again, knowing I didn't need to. I felt like whatever it was still watching me, the footsteps now at a safe distance, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. I reached the entrance to the road, and finally I saw the faint light of a gas station in the distance. Only then, with the adrenaline still rushing, could I stop to catch my breath. There were no more footsteps behind me, but to this day, I can't forget that sound, those footsteps, which still haunt me. I never figured out what happened that night. When I got to the gas station and talked to the attendant, he told me that during the fall some people would mention feeling strange presences in the forest, but nothing more than rumors. I tried to stay calm, but deep down, I knew something was off that night. It wasn't just fear. It was the feeling that something or someone was really watching me, waiting for the right moment to make me feel vulnerable. I left that forest and never went back. The feeling of being followed, that sound of footsteps, still haunts me, and the worst part is that I never got answers. Was someone really out there? Or was it all just my scared mind playing tricks on me? I still don't know. And no matter how hard I try, I can't shake that sound of footsteps from my head. Every time I'm alone in nature or somewhere isolated, I feel a twinge of dread, like somewhere in the shadows. Someone is still watching me.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.